Okay guys, today we are going to finish out World War II. The other day we finished out the war in Europe with Hitler's suicide and the German surrender. Today we're going to go back to Japan and the war in the Pacific. When we last left the war in the Pacific, the Americans were fighting on Iwo Jima and had won the battle, the last battle of the Pacific in Okinawa. Remember in Okinawa when we watched that little clip with Tom Hanks from the series The Pacific, remember the Americans were seeing things that they hadn't seen before. They saw civilians committing suicide. We did lessons on the kamikazes. By the time the Battle of Okinawa occurred, the Japanese were very desperate because Okinawa was very close to the Japanese homeland. We needed Iwo Jima, we needed Okinawa so we could launch our planes from there if we were to ever attack the Japanese mainland. Now, when the war in the Pacific came to an end, or was coming to an end, we had to make a decision. Are we going to invade the Japanese mainland, sending soldiers? It would obviously be an amphibious assault into Japan, or were we going to have another way to finish the war in the Pacific? Well, this is what happened. Victory in Japan is called VJ Day. It's going to happen on September 2nd, 1945. Our government decided to not invade mainland Japan, and instead we decided to drop the 2 atomic bombs. Now, the president at the time was President Harry Truman. FDR, Roosevelt, had died in April of a stroke in 1945. So a couple months later, Truman has to make a decision. And it's one of the toughest decisions a single person in the world has pretty much ever made. He was responsible for giving the okay to use nuclear weapons in a war for the first time. Now, they had to really look at the pros and they had to look at the cons. They had to look at the advantages and they had to look at the disadvantages. In fact, we're going to do that today in breakout sessions. But at the end, they decided that it was much easier to just simply drop the atomic bombs on Japan. So on August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima was targeted and the bomb was dropped, as you saw in our bell ringer. 190,000 folks were dead. Dead is in quotes because there's going to be much more than that will die of radiation sickness and so on. You can see a replica of that atomic bomb. It was called Little Boy. Now, before the bombing of Hiroshima, the Americans had dropped leaflets from planes, like little pieces of paper, all over Japan, basically saying that something bad is going to happen to you if you do not surrender. So we were trying to get the Japanese to surrender so it wouldn't have to lead to this. But when we heard no word back, President Truman and the Americans decided to drop this bomb. No response after the bombing of Hiroshima. The Japanese government still would not surrender, so the Americans decided to drop another bomb, and it was targeted a center called Nagasaki. On August 9th, 1945, 166,000 people died. Dead is in quotes because that number is going to climb much higher. In the film that you saw, the radius of it, you saw how many people died instantly, how many people died of burns, how many people died of, later on, of radiation sickness and cancer associated with the dropping of the atomic bomb. You can see there that the replica of the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki is down to the bottom right, and it was called Fat Man. Now, this decision to drop the nuclear weapons is still one of the most contradicted, criticized, talked about decisions that one human being has ever made. And we're going to do the same later on in this class period. Now, many people don't know that after the bombing of Nagasaki, the Americans planned to drop another bomb in September. They planned to drop another bomb in October. And they were going to drop bombs once a month on Japan until the Japanese would surrender. But after the devastation at Hiroshima, and after the devastation that the Japanese witnessed firsthand at Nagasaki, they decided to surrender. And they surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. It was a famous event. We're actually going to see a fantastic little video on this where you're going to see the leader of the American forces in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur. We're going to revisit him. You're going to actually bring this all to life. So every image that you see right here on the slide is images that you will see basically in the video. So it's going to be a fantastic little breakdown for you. Now, once the Japanese surrendered during the war in the Pacific, that means the war in Europe had already been done. Hitler had already committed suicide, and victory in Europe had already been achieved. So if the victory in Europe had been achieved, and now the Japanese surrendered, and we have victory in Japan, that means the war's over. So officially, when the Japanese surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, it didn't just end the war in the Pacific, it ended all of World War II. Now, I always like to finish up by showing you a couple neat charts of, just deaths. And this chart is the best, one of the best I found. You can look at all the Allied forces. You can look at all the Axis countries that fought there. In red, you can take a second and just look at the number of military deaths, and then look at the number of civilian deaths. Now, the civilian deaths in almost every single instance is much higher than the military deaths. So you can see that the red and the green are the total deaths, all right, once you add all those together, and you can see the total deaths as of 1945. The pie chart really tells a story there that the Axis civilians only lost about 4%, made up 4% of the deaths. The Axis military, the soldiers that fought for the Axis powers, made up 13%. The Allied military force, and then the Allied civilians, the biggest losers of this war that lost the most. 58% of the deaths in World War II were Allied civilians, all right, which can be China, which can be France, which can be Britain, which can be the Soviets. Tons of civilians died during the Operation Barbarossa and invasion of the Soviet Union, the Battle of Britain, France being occupied for 4 years, the Japanese involvement, and basically colonization of China, at least 1/4 of it during World War II. Speaking of China, you can look at this little chart and it shows you, military deaths and civilian deaths a little more clearly. So you can definitely see the Soviets and why the Soviets. If you ever want to ask why the Soviets were allowed to take the city of Berlin and find Hitler, well, the numbers right there are staggering as far as deaths. And remember, these numbers are probably going to be a bit higher, especially for the Soviets because there were so many of them, and for Germany because they didn't want to tell the world exactly how many soldiers and how many civilians died. The one wild card here is China. And look at the number of deaths that the Chinese had as far as civilians were concerned. 8 million Chinese civilians are going to die during World War II. And that just tells you, one of the original lessons was the Japanese going into China. And I told you that they weren't that nice to the Chinese, that, they would execute many Chinese people. And you can see that that number by the end of the war was up to 8 million civilians, okay? And then once again, you can see the United States, our numbers are low because we joined the war late, but our civilian deaths are low because there was no fighting on United States soil except for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So you can see those civilian deaths, and then as we go by, you can see the rest. Now, I always like to finish up the lesson by mentioning the Holocaust, and we'll talk about this event obviously more as the week goes along. And added to those civilian deaths, you can go ahead and take the approximately 6 million Jewish people that died during the Holocaust. And then what a lot of people don't know is that on top of the 6 million Jews, there were 9 to 10 million other groups of people that died during the Holocaust as well. Soviets, Slavs, all kinds of different kinds of people. People that were mentally and physically handicapped are considered others as far as this is concerned. So obviously, when you think back to World War I and you look at the numbers there, the numbers in World War II are just absolutely staggering. And that's how we wrap up the war. At this point, we're going to go ahead and watch a video of VJ Day. We're going to look at that, and then we're going to continue to look at the decision to drop the atomic bombs and finish off today with some breakout rooms talking about the advantages and the disadvantages of dropping the atomic bomb to end World War II.